It's a great pleasure to introduce our DeFord lecture speaker today, Dustin Trail. Dr. Dustin Trail is an associate professor from the University of Rochester. He got his bachelor degree in computer science, actually, in 2004. During his undergrad study, he found his true love in geology, and then he stayed at the University of Colorado to continue for a master's study, and he got his master in 2006 in geology. And during a field trip, he met Bruce Watson, and Bruce recruited him to RPI because Bruce saw his talent in environmental petrology. Within 4 years, Dustin finished his PhD at RPI in environmental petrology, and he has done groundbreaking work in zircon geochemistry, oxybarometry. In recognizing of his groundbreaking work, he got the 2017 MSA Award from the Mineralogical Society of America. And afterwards, he had been very productive, had broadened his research to fluid mineral interactions, planetary processes, astrobiology, and the origin of life in general. He also got the NSF Career Award. And basically, with all these, Dustin set up a very high standard for his following MSA awardees. All right, so today, Dustin will be talking about traversing the chemical landscape of the early Earth, which is most of his recent work just published as Science last month. Okay, so welcome, Dustin. It's all yours.
All right. Is that coming through okay? Great. Well, thank you so much for the very, very nice invitation. Too generous, to be honest. And I've really enjoyed my time here so far and visiting with many of you folks in the department. So what I wanted to do to get things started was to show a couple of illustrations, a few illustrations that generally depict a habitable Earth. And so I say the word generally here. Oh, I didn't get the lights, did I? I say the word generally here because you may be looking at this first illustration over here on the left by Chesley Bonstell. This, to the best of my knowledge, was first published in Life magazine in 1952. And for those of you that have seen an early Earth talk before, what you'll often see is half of this image, with the suggestion that we used to think that the Earth was hellish and completely inhospitable. So I thought it would be interesting to go track down this original Life magazine and just have a quick read of the article itself. And it says in there that it may have taken a few centuries for surface rocks to freeze, or a few thousand years, or some say a few million years. So this is actually pretty quick, even quicker than was largely expected at that time. And of course, we have some of these other representations by Don Dixon in 2000, and then another one here came out in 2021. And so for at least the last 7 centuries, there's been some suggestion, or some broad, at least some of the scientific community has believed that the Earth was habitable early on. And so I'd like to start there and provide just an update on some of our progress to determine early Earth environments, with the subject matter broken into 2 parts. And the first part, I'll talk about quickly some global constraints for the early Earth, as well as my approach for studying this problem. There are many different approaches for studying this problem. I see later on you have Brad Foley, who is an amazing modeler, and he will have another approach for studying the early Earth and early planetary bodies. So I'll talk about my approach, quick introduction, and then I'd like to spend most of my time discussing research to identify more local environments and processes, especially those that may have helped facilitate the emergence of life. So I did bring along this Life magazine issue, and I'll go ahead and I'll just pass that around in case you're interested in having a look, and I've actually popped it open to that page there that you see there on the left. So my approach for studying this problem is to focus specifically on remnants of the early Earth and crustal fragments that remain with ages that approach 4.4 billion years. And so there are numerous localities with materials that have been identified on Earth with ages that are greater than 4 billion years. However, the most famous of those localities is the Jack Hills in Western Australia, which has the oldest known terrestrial solids. These Jack Hills, they're metasediments deposited about 3 billion years ago. There's nothing particularly special about the appearance of this rock. What makes them special is that they have detrital zircons, crystals in them that have ages that extend back to 4.4 billion years. So here's the outcrop here. This is a cathodoluminescence image. You can see the quartz here, and there's right there is a zircon grain that's about 100 microns or so in size. And I'll also take this opportunity to point out that you can now see a piece of the conglomerate at the Smithsonian along with a grain mount. And I'll also mention that Mike Ackerson, who's the curator at the Smithsonian, is over the next coming years is planning on spearheading an effort to archive early Earth materials from not only the Jack Hills but the Augusta Gneiss, many different localities from around the planet that have ancient material in them that will be available for the scientific community. So if you're interested in studying these materials, you don't necessarily have to go to the Jack Hills, although I highly recommend it. You can have access to this through the Smithsonian. I'll also pass around a sample of the Jack Hills metaconglomerate, and so you can have a look at that. Okay, so just a quick couple of notes. Establishing some basic parameters that suggest our planet was habitable. The first evidence that strongly suggested we had a habitable planet was through the analysis of oxygen isotopes in zircon. So it was discovered that oxygen isotopes in zircon crystals were distinct from those of the mantle, from zircons that were crystallizing from mantle sources. And the first order interpretation of this is that they must have these zircons, the melts and the igneous systems that produce these zircons must have included a component of low temperature material that was altered due to water rock interactions, and that material was subsequently buried and remelted, taking with it its oxygen isotope signature that was incorporated into the zircon. So this is something that's we see here on Earth today. Isotope values that are out of equilibrium with the mantle indicate low temperature water rock processes on our planet. So this suggests that water was stable, altering rock, interacting with the surface environment. A second general line of evidence is that these zircons had crystallization temperatures that indicate the presence of some volatiles dissolved in the magmas. And so this is this is temperature here along the x-axis. This is the frequency here, and the blue histogram are those of the Jack Hills, showing approximately 700 degree C crystallization temperature, 680 degrees. But a temperature that is consistent with the presence of volatiles, which contrasts with at least part of the distribution of titanium crystallization temperatures from lunar zircons. So there's evidence that there are volatiles present in these magmas. So what types of volatiles were they? Were they more neutral species or were they more reduced? So we were able to gain some insight into that through the analysis of our rust meter here. So cerium is redox sensitive. It's incorporated into zircon more so when it is oxidized, or when it's found in the cerium 4+ state. That's this anomaly that you're seeing here on this partition coefficient versus rare earth element diagram. And so the larger the anomaly, in principle, the more oxidized the magma or the system is. And so with that information, one can calibrate the oxidation state of the system and make generalizations about the type of volatiles that were present in Hadean magmas. And so the major components were CO2, H2O, perhaps some sulfur dioxide with perhaps a minor amount of carbon monoxide, methane. The sort of last introduction slide before we get into some new science. So there's a general conclusion that the early Earth was habitable. It's reasonable to expect, however, that some or all prebiotic chemistries on Earth were localized. So if we're thinking about a habitable planet and we'd like to explore whether or not the conditions were right for the emergence of life, and we're also considering what conditions may have been present in localized environments, this is kind of our next step, is to work to identify more local environments and processes, including those that may have helped facilitate the emergence of life. So that's what I like to really do, is couple this question of hopefully largely resolved question of planetary habitability for the early Earth, and now start to think about localized environments in which life could have emerged, and start to characterize those localized environments. And so we'll start off with some clues for the types of crusts being altered or recycled, rather than sort of general statements of water-rock interaction. I'll then spend some time on fluid-crust interaction in the lithosphere. This is sub-solidus, under sub-solidus conditions, and then some new strategies for revealing the impact history of the Earth-Moon system. So we'll do this by adding an additional isotope dimension. On the y-axis here is delta O18. On the x-axis here is delta silicon 30. So zircon is a zirconium silicate. So it has oxygen as well as silicon as part of its crystal structure. And what is interesting about silicon isotopes, particularly in the context of weathering, is that it has different trajectories that provide additional resolution with respect to the types of crusts that may have been altered than is possible with just oxygen isotopes. So for example, if this is a representation of bulk silicate Earth during serpentinization, there's generally no difference in the delta silicon 30 value. With silica precipitation, for instance, that occurs during seawaters, the formation of chert, you have an enrichment in the heavy isotopes. So this is enrichment in heavy isotopes, whereas there's a depletion in the heavy isotopes during chemical weathering or desilicification. So effectively what you have is potentially a way to determine different weathering reactions that were happening on the early Earth. So, but to do that, one of the first things we need is a way to relate the silicon isotopic chemistry of the crystal, of the zircon crystal, to the rest of the rock. So I'll actually pass around a couple of rocks now. So just imagine for a moment that you're measuring the silicon isotopes of different minerals in this rock. They will be different. And so what you need is a relationship that allows you to understand the magnitude of that difference. And so that's where the experiments come into play, and that's what we can do with these experiments. Now, I'll say one more thing about these rocks that I'm passing around now. These are from the Sudbury impact melt sheet. So these are different melt sheet units. So Sudbury was was an impact that happened about 2 billion years ago and produced this massive melt sheet that's still available for study and for sampling today. And so the last part of my talk, we'll talk a little bit more about the Sudbury impact melt sheet. So this is the granophere unit. It's kind of like, you should be able to pick out which is, well, it's written on there, and this one's a norite. But these are both from the Sudbury impact melt sheet. But if you're just in the context of this conversation, those minerals in there, they have different silicon isotopic compositions. So we need to figure out what those differences are. So we can take a zircon grain and relate that back to the entire rock. And so one of the ways we can do this is with some experiments. So these experiments are done in a similar fashion to, if you've heard Chen talk about piston cylinder experiments, these are how these experiments were done. You're effectively taking some quartz and some zircon, you're putting those two minerals together, and what this is showing you is actually you're effectively doing a series of experiments calibrating the fractionation between these two minerals as they're approaching their equilibrium compositions. And so with that information at different temperatures, you can start then to predict what the offset is, the silicon isotope offset is between a whole rock and that of the zircon. And so that's the kind of the first step, is let's figure out what that offset is so we can measure the zircon and then calculate what the whole rock is, so to figure out if we've got P-lights, if we've got cherts, or whatever we happen to have. Now, to give you some more context on what these experimental capsules look like, I'll pass this around. You'll see one that looks really beat up and crushed. That one has obviously seen some pressure and temperature. And then you'll see another bucket as well as a platinum capsule in here that is getting ready or is in the process of being prepared for an experiment. So I'll send those around so you get some context for size. And these are actually very big capsules. It's like 5 millimeters. So once you have that information, then you can take it and calculate the delta silicon 30 of the whole rock. And so this is relative to some standard that's not super important. What's important here is first of all, the offset from the mantle. So the mantle delta silicon 30 values fall down here in this red line. And then rocks that are above this other dashed line could carry a proportion of seawater-derived silica in their protoliths. So that's what those two horizontal dashed lines are. And now these diamonds, these blue diamonds here, are the calculated whole rock values for Hadean zircons. So what you're seeing is, by and large, while there is data that fall below this line, by and large, the majority of the data fall above this line, as does whole rock data collected from other Archean granitoid systems by Luc Andre. So this is indicating that there was the presence of chert or perhaps silicified rock on the Hadean Earth. So we can perhaps make this model a little bit more complete. So this is work by my former student, Riju Chaudhry, who conducted some laboratory experiments to measure the zircon melt partition coefficients of several elements. And then what he did using those partition coefficients is he calculated what the melt composition may have been like for these Hadean zircons. And in doing so, he found that, for example, with respect to thorium ytterbium and niobium ytterbium, that they plot up here in a modern island arc overlapping with modern continental arc field, but separate from Moore lavas or IOB lavas. So perhaps a more complete model is that there was reworking of basalts that were silicified in the presence of seawater. Perhaps that reworking happened at a plate boundary like system in the Hadean. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a couple of other things that we've been doing. Among those are work that we've been doing to better understand halogen cycling and more generally volatile cycling and fluxing between the solid Earth and the surface of our planet. So, and there are people here at UT Austin that know way more about this than I do. Jamie Barnes, for example, who's extremely knowledgeable about this idea of halogen incorporation, perhaps during serpentinization, its role on the modern Earth and subduction zone environments, and then how that gets brought back to the surface through outgassing or incorporated into minerals along that path. So if I could kind of take us now out of the context of the modern Earth and think about what early outgassing might have looked like, or rather what halogen fluxing might have looked like on our planet 4 billion years ago. So here's a couple of possible models. One is there's a early outgassing followed by early outgassing of halogens followed by a progressive regassing. Or another possibility is that there's a progressive outgassing. Or perhaps there's an early outgassing followed by a balance, an equilibrium where the outgassing balances the regassing, or the outgassing of halogens is balanced by the reincorporation of halogens into the solid Earth. And so let's have a look at some of these old zircon data to see if we can better distinguish among these different models. This is done in collaboration with Haolan Tang as well as Bethan Bell. At the time, they were both at UCLA while I was doing a sabbatical there, and so it was a great opportunity to collaborate with them on this project. So what you're seeing here on the x-axis, the y-axis is fluorine plotted versus age of the crystal, and over here on the right side is chlorine, again plotted versus age of the crystal. And so while we're working on acquiring a more comprehensive data set, what you do see is some possible evidence for in zircons with both increased chlorine and fluorine contents around 4 billion years ago. So this could be actually evidence for this early, potentially an early outgassing, followed by subsequent regassing. However, this is still something we're investigating, and we're still spending some time on trying to figure this out in more detail. Keeping in mind that these are just chlorine and fluorine contents in the zircon themselves, so we would need to couple this with some experiments to determine the fluorine and chlorine contents of the melts and produce a more robust and comprehensive model. So from that, I'll transition now to some work we've been doing on fluid-crust interaction with the lithosphere, so all of this being under sub-solidus conditions. And so in doing so, let's focus in and have a closer look at some of these grains. So remembering that this is the crystallization temperature of the zircon, and the wet granite solidus was, in the previous version of this figure, was drawn at around 650 degrees. And so below that, zircons with crystallization temperatures below that ought to have formed under sub-solidus conditions. So just revisiting this, our halogen data, if we look at the chlorine content now of these sub-solidus zircons, so these zircons that formed outside of an igneous setting, they tend to be more enriched. And we can also plot this as a ratio of chlorine over fluorine and zircon, along with the igneous data, and we can see that they're clearly distinct. Certainly the sub-solidus zircons have more chlorine associated with their crystal structure than those of their igneous counterparts. So let's see if we can use this information and other geochemical signatures to help build a local early Earth environment. So we have these sub-solidus grains. They crystallize outside of an igneous environment. Let's take that information and see if we can now use it to construct a possible early Earth environment. So to start off kind of simple here. So I was having a conversation about trying to learn how to draw an Illustrator with someone earlier today. So these are kind of some of my earlier attempts. So you have these sub-solidus grains. So you have a heat source, presumably of some sort. We also have oxygen isotope data on these grains. So this is delta 018, this is now age here. And importantly, there's a number of grains that land in this sub-mantle field where there's no alteration horizontal line, as well as these error bounds represent mantle zircon. So we have a couple of these grains, a few of these grains that fall beneath this. The easiest way to do that, the simplest way to do that, is with meteoric water. So we see this today at Iceland or Yellowstone. If we go analyze quartz or zircon from Yellowstone, from Iceland, particularly components of the crust that have been remelted or metamorphosed, they will inherit this meteoric water signature in the grains themselves. And so that's what we think we're seeing here, is the inheritance of this isotope, this oxygen isotope fingerprint, which tells us that these zircons are forming in an environment with meteoric water. This also is an important observation that points towards a subaerial environment. So an environment above land. So we're not talking about something that's beneath an ocean, but rather a subaerial environment. So we can imagine that we've got some meteoric water that's percolating down through here in permeable volcanic rock. It's interacting with a heat source. These zircons are crystallizing or recrystallizing. We've also done some experiments to constrain the oxidation state of these detrital zircons. These fluids are relatively oxidizing when compared to the average estimate for Earth's mantle at this time. So something close to, for those of you calibrated in FO2 space, something close to FMQ +1. We can also take into consideration that hot fluids are buoyant and they ought to rise back to the surface. So thinking of an environment in which you have hydrothermal pools. And so this is the environment that is consistent with the geochemical data. You have a subaerial environment in which there's a component of meteoric water that's interacting with perhaps a permeable volcanic rock, altering the rock, potentially crystallizing zircon with heat source, and then potentially that fluid is re-emerging in the surface as a hydrothermal pool. And so again, a possible modern day example of this is in Iceland or in Yellowstone. So we then took this information and took our constraints and we put it into geochemical reaction path models that allowed us to calculate the equilibrium composition of the fluid, and then take that fluid, bring it closer to the surface, and then recalculate the equilibrium composition of the fluid, and so on and so forth until we reach the surface of of our hydrothermal pool. So what you're seeing over here on the left, this is just the solubility and the concentration of different metals as well as different volatile species as a function of oxygen fugacity. Here is the range over which the oxygen fugacity is predicted for these sub-solidus zircons. And then over here on the right, you're seeing effectively the evolution of the fluid and the composition of that fluid from 580 degrees C up to the surface. So each one of these points, these data points that you see, these horizontal data points lined up along the way, are equilibrium compositions of the fluid en route to the surface. And so you can take that information. This is basically like a sieve that is sorting out different metals, bringing some in higher concentration to the surface while leaving others behind. And so we can take that information and you can use it to start to test certain origin of life models and start to test how, for example, the prebiotic metal loam may have looked. So today, if you want to think about how we're kind of classify the study of biology, it might be by the genome, the study of genes, the proteome, which is study of proteins. There's also the metallome, which is study of metals and their interaction in the role that they play in biology and in proteins. In fact, there's something like a third of all modern proteins today require some sort of helper ion or a metal cofactor for it to do its job. So this speaks to an intimate connection between biology and the solid Earth. And so we're hoping to shed some light on this. As I mentioned, there's in modern biology, enzyme metal cofactors. This is just kind of another way of saying helper ions, such as copper, iron, zinc are common in modern proteins. In our study here, we found that zinc and nickel concentrations were 5 orders of magnitude more abundant than copper. So copper has been an important suspected element in origin of life, prebiotic chemistry. We don't see a huge evidence for its enrichment here, at least in the results seen in this study. But what we can say, what we can say is that zinc and nickel are known to increase the absorption of prebiotic compounds such as nucleotides onto clays. And so if we're thinking about these kind of the interface between the solid Earth and prebiotic chemistry, we're starting to pick out which elements might be serving this role. We also showed that there's mixed valence, evidence for mixed valence oxyhydroxide, so basically iron 2+ and iron 3+, which may enhance the formation of amino acids. So this is kind of something we rolled up and with the help of Thomas McCollum, who's an expert at working through these types of geochemical reaction path models, published earlier this year. So moving on now just to some strategies for revealing the impact history of the early Earth. I'm putting in this figure that we put together came out last year in an EOS issue. And you notice that the sky is very red here, like orange, very different than what I showed earlier. And there is some evidence, or I should say some models rather, that have argued for a potentially reducing atmosphere, so methane-rich atmosphere resulting from a large impact on the early Earth. So the idea being that the presence or the availability of native iron could have acted as a reducing agent, and that this would have led to a transient methane-rich atmosphere in which all kinds of interesting UV enhanced photochemistry could have happened. And so this is, we can certainly, it's certainly an important process to study, an important exogenous process to study when thinking about planetary habitability. So we've been doing some laboratory shock experiments to to first see if we can gain some better insight to how zircon behaves under such conditions. So this is the experimental impact laboratory at Johnson Space Center. A lot of this, almost all of this work was done by former PhD student Ian Zumilla, starting a postdoc at Carnegie this summer. But what I'll send around, this is actually really useful for, at least for me. This is an impact crater that was produced by this 5 or 6 millimeter bolide that you see here that's taped to the side here. And so, and this was this was impacted at 6 kilometers per second. So, you know, an incoming impactor may have been 20 or even 30 kilometers per second. So a factor of, you know, 3 more. So what I hope this helps you conceptualize is how impacts can profoundly change the composition of the surface or change the structure of the surface of the planet. So you can even see, like, when I look at the back of this, you can even see evidence that, you know, the aluminum has been deformed on the back. So automatically I'm thinking, what is this like? What does an impactor do to the mantle? And like, what, you know, there's just, it's a pretty neat. So this was this sample that's going around was given to me by Chris Klein, who helps run the gun lab. So what we wanted to do is take, for example, if you were to discover a high pressure phase, let's say a phase that you can reasonably rule out formed in Earth's crust, and you discover that phase, and you then are able to date that phase to determine the age of that phase. Have you dated the impact events? And probably the simple answer is yeah. You know, like it's high pressure phase. I dated the impact event. So we can ask exactly this question. So this is zircon here. This is a phase diagram for the ZrSiO4 phase diagram. This is temperature here, and this is pressure. And you know, this is the PT space over which zircon is found. And then as you get up to higher pressures, whether that's a static pressure, so something like a multi-anvil, or whether you are conducting shock experiments, you have a stability field for a polymorph of zircon, which is rhyolite. So different structures, a little bit denser, still in the tetragonal crystal system. So if you find rhyolite, you date it. Do you get the age of the impact event? So we shock some samples, we produced some rhyolite, we dated the rhyolite, determined the age of it. This is done by ion microprobe work. And while there is a bit more scatter here, the age is largely unchanged from the starting zircon. So this is kind of an important observation that we need to keep in mind. If we find a high pressure phase, and we can determine the age of it, we haven't necessarily dated the age of the impact event. So determining the age of a high pressure phase does not necessarily date the impact event. So this is, I should mention, this is on a Concordia diagram. So this is 206 lead over 238 uranium, so daughter parent. And this is 207 lead over 235 uranium on this Concordia diagram. And then Ian put together some PT models of the shock to understand what pressures and temperatures the zircons and subsequently the rhyolite experienced during this shock experiment at Johnson Space Center. So, but what about melt sheets? Is there something we can do with melt sheets? So this was a pandemic lockdown project. We had folks at home, no experimental lab. So what do you do? Who can code? Who wants to code? So Ian, turns out Ian really likes to code, and this was unknown to me until the pandemic. So we started doing some machine learning. The basic idea being, almost maybe too simple of an idea. Take zircon formed by endogenous processes, so formed from processes that are happening in the earth, and measure the chemistry or compile the chemistry of these grains. And you can do that through data mining in either databases that are publicly available, like the GeoRock database. So there's like tens of thousands of zircons. And we also had an undergraduate who was pulling data from the literature. So you can bin that, take that, and call that one group of data. And then you can also take zircon from impact melt sheets formed, via processes that, when we think of melting happening on the Earth, by decompression, melting, or adiabatic decompression, or fluxing, it's happening via a very different process than an impact that's striking a planetary surface. So we compiled zircons from impact melt sheets, and unfortunately the data set for zircons from impact melt sheets is quite small. So something like 330 can put together this kind of example of how this worked, at least with our first iteration through this. We've got our input layer with different trace elements, our connecting weights between these layers with our hidden layers, and then an output, which is, was it an impact produced zircon that formed in a melt sheet, or was it produced by some other endogenous process? And so we did that, we trained the model. We basically told it, it was a supervised training model, so we said, this is produced in an impact, here's what its chemistry looks like. And then we took some of that data that we had left over after training, and in particular zircons that were formed in melt sheets, and said, okay, we just trained the model, now where did these zircons form from? And so in 56 out of 62 of those examples, they identified as forming from an impact melt sheet. So this is encouraging, promising, but if we're going to take this tool and apply it to a detrital zircon, we need significantly more information and more data to basically train the model before we can do this. And just to, I'll note also that Ian is trying to put together a graphical user interface where you can import your data. When this is finished, it will be made available, where you can import your data, either click a button, it imports it automatically from GeoRock, or click a button, it automatically imports it from your Excel spreadsheet, and then performs a variety of different functions. Maybe you want to train, do a different type of neural network training. Maybe you want, instead of, impacts produced zircon or other endogenous sources, maybe you want like a tonalite and a granite here or something. It'll, in principle, be able to do that when we're finished with this. But we're still data limited on this question of, can we use this type of tool to determine and perhaps search for impact melt sheets in the detrital zircon record. So once kind of the smoke cleared, we went up to the Sudbury. You saw those rocks go around earlier. So this is one of the largest and oldest impact structures, preserved impact structures on Earth. So, and again, an age of almost 2 billion years. The crater diameter, see the outline of the crater in the melt sheet, has been highly deformed, but it had an original diameter of approximately 200 kilometers. We went up there, sampled some rocks, and we've gone through and now made a suite of trace element measurements. This was presented by Venecia Lopez at AGU last year. And we've also been to the Smithsonian now looking for additional zircons from impact melt sheets besides Sudbury to help train this model. And so that's kind of where we are on that. And with this, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. This has clearly been a zircon-focused approach to help explore the early Earth. But we need all approaches. We don't just need the experimental approach mixed with the measurements of natural samples. We need a whole range of approaches to better understand this period of Earth's history over 4 billion years ago. Water-rock interaction in the Hadean, so the first 500 million years of Earth history, it seems to at least have been punctuated or the result of reworking of basalts that were silicified by seawater. That's a result that came out of the silicon isotopes story. And the trace elements in zircon imply the melts may have had similar chemistry to modern arc settings. And the halogens and the halogen information that I presented show evidence for perhaps an early outgassing. We still need to do some more work on that, followed by perhaps a regassing. So there was that punctuated spike at around 4 billion years, followed by a decrease in the halogen content of zircons. Sub-solidus early Earth crustal fluids are relatively oxidized, and through a combination of models and other constraints, we can model fluid composition to the surface of the planet and perhaps characterize the fluids that were feeding hydrothermal pools on our planet 4 billion years ago. Dating the age of a high pressure phase that's been shocked into that phase may not always date the shock event. So there's perhaps something important that we've learned there. And finally, this machine learning approach combined with trace elements in detrital zircon may be a promising method to help identify and date early Earth impacts. So the goal here, we're setting the stage for the goal, which is really, you've got a detrital zircon that's 4.2 billion years old. Can you tell me if that came from an impact melt sheet? And if you can answer yes, that's a pretty neat result. You've basically dated an impact event on the early Earth for which a crater has been destroyed, probably 4.1 billion years ago. So I'll go ahead and just leave you with that. Maybe one last slide, which is that I went to one of these image generating pieces of software and I asked politely, please generate an illustration of a realistic terrestrial landscape 4.4 billion years ago. And all of these kind of look habitable. We've of course got some Hadean trees, so that's kind of interesting, but at least as far as if these image generating software is sort of a collection of human knowledge that is used to generate this information, in general, it seems that we have, as in terms of humanity, we've converged on the early Earth as being somewhat habitable, at the very least. All right, thanks. I'll take any questions at this point.